So we've seen what is called primary growth, and now we're moving on to secondary growth. Obviously, these are happening first and second, and it's kind of two strategies for growing of the plant. We saw previously how the primary growth is growing from the tips and secondary growth is growing in thickness. So highlighting on our intro slide here, one thing that plants can achieve with this thickening growth gets them the woody trunks of these enormous trees. So these are gentlemen who are cutting down a redwood tree that is mostly made up of cells that were put there during these secondary growth phases. So let's review here a little bit about what you get as a result of secondary growth. Secondary growth, probably the most memorable result of secondary growth is that it produces wood. So woody tissues, woody plants. So these are locally are trees and shrubs, and both of them have advantages that they get from putting on a lot of this woody tissue. So obviously this is a very durable tissue. This is what people use. If you want to build a house out of wood, you take apart a tree and you take advantage of its strength. So it has this very strong up and down strength to support the mass of all the growing living tissues above ground. And also to resist some forces that are pushing it side to side. Also good properties that you want in your timbers of your house. So what do you get for growing tall? Obviously you get to be more massive. That's increasing just overall biomass of the plant. What does a plant get for increased biomass? Well, one thing that we haven't really talked about, but we will when we get to reproductive biology of plants, is that their reproductive structures can be produced along all of these branches. So the above ground portion of a plant, if it gets bigger and it has a lot more shoot tips spread throughout, all those shoot tips are able to produce and distribute seeds. They're able to produce leaves that increase the plant's intake of photosynthesis results. So more sugar production, more light capture. So a larger plant overall just has greater reproductive output is probably something we can generalize about. Besides that, though, just if you compared, even without thinking about the bulk, the mass of these plants, but this the height of a tree versus the height of a herbaceous plant. Trees locally, when they have the experience of dropping their leaves in the fall, they're losing some of their biomass, but they retain some living cells above ground. So being able to keep their leaves and buds for other tissues above ground allows them to come back in the spring from a location much higher off the ground. So our woody plants are contrasted with herbaceous plants. You can see some herbaceous plants in this image down at the ground level. They can grow as tall as they can get from the ground where they start in the spring up until however high they can grow off the ground before the growing season is done. And they have to start from the ground every year. That's kind of the definition of being herbaceous, is they have to start their growth from the ground every year. Woody plants can start from high up, which means that they can capture light up here with the first leaves that they put out. They can attract pollinators far above ground if they have an animal pollinator. They can do pollination if it's abiotic, if it's helped by the wind. They can have pollen moving around in the wind much higher off the ground. Being high off the ground is a good place to catch some wind and get the pollen distributed from one flower to another. And we see that in some of the flowers. A lot of trees, you may not think about them having flowers because the flowering happens in a lot of these early in the season and with inconspicuous flowers that aren't very attractive because they're wind pollinated. So they're not attracting an animal. This one here in the top center is an oak plant, and the oak male flowers here, these dangly bunches of male flowers that are distributing pollen. And they can do that very early in the year because a couple things: they have stored energy that they can use to build those structures and support them. And they also have just they're high off the ground, and so they can make those structures and distribute the pollen very far in between plants. So just lots of examples of flowers above ground on these woody plants, a lot of them inconspicuous, and then just an example of animal associations, kind of illustrating the hardness of wood here. And then just a cool video here showing something that really illustrates, I think, the strength of a tree. So trees, as I mentioned, have the wood that can support them not to fall over. They're strong and sturdy in the upper direction, but also pretty sturdy against movement side to side. So if you ever have the misfortune of driving into a tree, your car will have a bad experience. The tree may have a mildly bad experience. Okay, so back to primary growth. Primary growth, as we saw before, is growth from the tips of these plants. Just to remind you that we have two major tips, the shoot tip and the root tip. So when we talk about apex in plants, we're not always talking about the top tip, but we could be talking about the bottom tip. So the root apex at the tip of the root and the shoot apex at the tip of the shoot. And sometimes there's this central one. They start off with a central one shoot apex and one root apex, but as branching happens, that basically generates new versions of root apices. So there's root apex here, but also these side roots also have apices. The shoot apex here, kind of the main central shoot apex, but also some lateral branches that have apices off to the side. So plants, the general form of a plant is to repeat structures across the plant. And so the top or the sides, basically the tips. So growing from the tips is what we call primary growth. And secondary growth is more of an internal growth based on tissues that have already been established. And the growth happens basically increase in width or girth or thickening. And this is important because if you had a plant that just continued to grow upwards over time, if it was only doing primary growth, see it keeps going up there, even with a little bit of side growth maybe to balance it out. If that kept happening, eventually this little short shoot stem would not be very strong and it would probably collapse over under its own weight. Whereas if you have a plant that as it gets older, it can also get thicker, then this is something that's more protected against movement side to side, more sturdy to support a larger plant. So we see secondary growth is not restricted to woody plants, but we kind of emphasize it in the woody plants. But even a substantial herbaceous plant can have some of this secondary growth, some of this technically woody tissue that resists this side-to-side movement. And again, just the difference between a woody and a herbaceous plant for us in the temperate north is that our herbaceous plants, no matter what they've built, whether it's a little woody or a little more juicy, no matter what they built, it dies down to the ground during the winter. Okay, so how do you build something from the inside? Building from the inside involves these secondary meristems. So we saw apical meristems on the previous slide, referring to the apex. And meristem is just this term that refers to basically a period, location on the plant where there is lots of cell division, new kinds of cells are made and growth happens. And the internal meristems, we have this term called cambia, and the singular is cambium. That's kind of a term reserved for that kind of growth, and the cells that produce those are the meristem cells, so cambium, meristem. And we'll see the kinds of meristems here. Two big kinds, the vascular cambium and the cork cambium. And they have their own kinds of cells that they make. So the vascular cambium here is making new xylem cells to one side and new phloem cells to the other side. So each kind, phloem. Typically, we probably think a little bit more about the vascular cambium. The cork cambium is producing bark. You can mostly think of that as happening toward the outside. And sometimes we use in botany a little more technical, we like to call this cork, but cork and bark, parts of those are kind of synonymous. So these are areas where growth happens. We'll see that they're very important to have these two kinds. The vascular cambium, when we think about wood, This whole section in here, this is wood. Wood is made up of what we call secondary xylem. So xylem produced from the secondary growth. And as the plant grows, this is going to be the most massive, the most permanent part of that growth. And the phloem, proportionally, the phloem stays a pretty small part of this structure. And it's actually the xylem that's going to fill in and make the woody part of a plant, certainly a tree anyway. All right. All right, so how do these relate to the original tissues? The primary tissues are laid down right after when the shoot meristem makes them. And so we have a big portion in the middle, which is the central ground tissue. It's called the pith, and that's still there. So one of these plant principles, as plants grow, the cells that they make basically stay in place. So there's no replacing the pith, it just stays there, and the new tissue is built next to it. And where the new tissue comes from, it's actually produced in a location in between the primary xylem and the primary phloem. So in between those, xylem cells are the easiest to identify here. In between them is a layer of ground cells, these parenchyma or meristematic cells. They can do more growing. So we have differentiated phloem, they have differentiated xylem, but in secondary growth, these cells make new phloem to the outside and new xylem to the inside. And so it ends up being this little vascular bundle of xylem ends up filling in a circle all the way around the stem to be lots and lots of xylem over the course of the next few years of growth. And this is kind of how it works developmentally. So we saw in the cross sections of stems that the vascular bundles were often, vascular cells are often associated in bundles. So we got xylem and phloem together in this working together structure, xylem toward the inside, phloem toward the outside. And as that ring of the vascular cambium, as it starts making new xylem and new phloem, joins this all together. So what started as a ring ends up being, or I guess a ring of bundles, ends up being a continuous ring. Kind of fills in, and then it keeps growing in a ring fashion. And then, like I said, the vascular cambium cells are making new xylem cells toward the inside, new phloem cells toward the outside. This illustration is just showing how the meristem cells stay meristem cells, so they divide, and some of the cells that result from division become the new xylem or phloem cells, and then other cells sort of stay as cambium cells. As the cells are made, we mostly think of the water conducting xylem cells as going up and down. That is the majority of them, but also in the xylem are these side moving xylem cells, which are called rays. And so in this section here, you can see the up and down. They've got some rather long xylem cells conducting water upwards, but then lots of cells that have been cut in cross section heading toward us. So we're kind of looking through toward the center of the plant. We see a lot of these ray cells heading toward us. So it takes a little bit of, I guess, practice or three-dimensional thinking to put these images together and understand how they fit. These are different sections of a woody plant, and in cross section, you can see that we've cut most of the xylem cells across, so we can see their shape in the cross section. So quite a few of them are open, like we've seen in xylem cells, open with thick secondary walls. And they do major water conduction with these big open cells. And along those, there also are these strings of cells running up and down. So those are the ray cells, sort of the tracks of the rays. So the water has to move up and down in the plant, but it also needs to go a little bit side to side. So if water is being pulled up from the roots, there will be cells along the way that need water. So if you have, let's see here. Let's say you got a woody plant, generic tree here. Get some underground portion. So most of this trunk is doing water conduction upward. Portions within this trunk, as we'll see, there are still some living cells. And they are next to the xylem cells that are conducting the water, but they're going to need some of that water. So it's important to have a little bit of sideways movement to feed the living cells. They need water, they need sugar from the photosynthesis. So they're kind of tapped into the stream of water up from the roots and sugar down from the leaves to support them. Also having those sideways movement cells, the rays, help to distribute the water. So sort of like a system of highways. So if you had a highway running through the neighborhood and you didn't have any on-ramps, you wouldn't have the ability to actually use that highway. Another thought is if that highway ever had to close, so if there's damage to the xylem system and water can't move throughout, it's good to have some side roads, backup to connect the various highways together. So xylem highway, the xylem highway. So takes a little practice, I'd say, to look at these images and tell you what you're looking at. Cross section, probably the easiest to think about. So the top disc here is a cross section through a woody stem. The radial section is what you would get if you sliced right along one of these pie slices. So straight to the middle and out to the edge. And if you looked at the side of your pie slice, you'd get something like this, where you still see those xylem cells moving up and down, but you cut the ray cells right as they're moving sideways to you. And then the tangential section would be a little bit like this. Like if you look through the middle of a pie slice, you again see the xylem cells mostly moving up and down, but the ray cells, now you would see them moving toward or away from you. So the arrangement of the cells in the xylem is related to how we use wood for various functions. So I mentioned that wood is tough. You can buy beams to support your house made out of wood. And the supportive angle of a piece of wood, it's most supportive if you support it in the way that it was in the tree. So if you get a tree that's growing straight up and down, and you take that lumber out of the tree and you support yourself up and down, a post or a beam in your house, that's where it's most supportive. And the support for the wood also is illustrated a little bit by how easy it is to chop through things. So if you were cutting a tree down, if you tried to use an axe, you got to chop your way in from the side of this plant, chop, 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 chop. But if you want to split the wood, as demonstrated here, it's actually fairly easy to split wood in the up and down direction, because that's where most of the fibers are going. So the support for the tree, again, has a lot of support to prevent it from being moved side to side, but it doesn't really encounter this kind of force where it's being torn apart in the wood part. All right, I want to also highlight on here, this is an illustration I found of various cuts of wood that people can use from a log. So if you cut a tree down, you can make use of those pieces of wood in different ways. Depending on where the grain lies, that gives it different strengths in different parts, maybe a resistance to warping or something like that. So here we've got in the center probably a fence post, one of the sturdiest pieces of wood, the center piece, and then some 1x4, 2x4s, whatever these are, kind of in the middle outer zone. Okay, so as trees grow, you probably know that they put down these rings that you can see. And what exactly do the rings on a tree signify? Well, it turns out that the differences between the start of this ring and the end of this ring, so number 2 is the second year of growth. And you can kind of see how the cells change in size. There's some big fat cells in the middle toward the center of this plant. And then toward the outside, you get smaller cells. So within a ring on a plant, let's say we got a piece of wood here, some bark on the outside. When you see a growth ring on a plant, the reason you see the ring is that there's kind of a darkness toward one end of this. And in general, the ring is you can kind of generalize and say that part of it is put down in the spring season, and then part of it is put down in the summer season. These are the main growing parts of the year for plants. And in contrast, to contrast these two seasons, the spring is an area where there's a lot more water abundance. And having a lot of water means that the plant can get luxurious and produce some large water conducting xylem cells. And as the plant gets closer toward the summer, that's when things get hotter and drier. And water is less available. So the cells, the xylem cells in this region get smaller. And you kind of see that. I'll try to exaggerate it here a little bit, but the cells get smaller as you go toward the edges of this plant. And so it actually looks like a difference in the color. And that's what gives us the ring. So 1 year starts with some really great big cell growth, and then slows down as conditions get bad. And then the plant goes dormant from basically one summer to the next spring. And then the cycle will start again with big cells again. Let me draw this a little bit better. Big cells again, they get small toward the next summer again. So year after year after year, we get these growth ring patterns. And so I've got, like I was describing them as spring wood, summer wood, you can call them early wood and late wood. Here's that pattern I was mentioning. So kind of on the inner edge of where one year gives way to the next. It's got a nice dark ring around the outside. And then inside of that are some of the smaller cells. So there's kind of a shady region going in. And you've probably done this before where you can count these rings, and these should tell you how old the plant was. Not only that, but also giving us an indication of how good the growing season was in all of those years. So regions where the growth rings are fat means that the plant was able to put on a lot of biomass that year. That was a good year. So plants are often limited for water availability. Maybe there's a condition where the light availability to this plant changes, but largely it comes down to water. So how much water is there in a year? When there's lots of water around, plants can capitalize and do more growth. If there's less water, they can't grow quite as much. And this is a nice illustration just of that on a more microscopic scale, the change in the cell size. So big cells here giving way to small cells right at the end of the growing season. And this is a graph showing the quantitative movement. So you can measure the diameter of wood, of the xylem cells, I should say. And so big diameter down here and then smaller diameter as you get close to the end of the year. So growth rings, we can use them to count how old a single tree is, and you also can use them to compare one tree to another. So the general principle is that trees growing in the same area experience the same years. So if there's a year when conditions for growing are good, all the trees in that area will grow well. If there's a year when the growth conditions are bad, say there's a drought or a fire, these might be conditions or years when the growth is very poor, and those will be reflected as smaller rings. And that, this pattern gives rise to a field of study called dendrochronology. So dendro for tree and chronology for the study of time. And this is the study of understanding what trees can tell us about time, or basically using trees to date events. So if you find a tree from some point in the past, you can use this method to match it up with other information about trees in that area and basically try to figure out when something happened. So some examples here, say you have a log cabin, you want to know when this log cabin was built. So the log cabin is built out of logs, and a good chance that those logs were cut down from trees that were alive that year, or at least in years pretty close to when the log cabin was built. So the oldest rings on that tree will be before the log cabin was built, or up to and including the year the log cabin was built. And you can match the pattern of those logs with patterns from other logs. So let's say we have a living tree that has a similar pattern. So kind of like a barcode, you line them up. Here we've got some measurements that overlap quite well. And then this tree here that's still alive today, we have the same pattern and give you a reference for when this log cabin was built. So in the living trees, you work your way back from today. They're still alive, they're still putting tree rings on, work your way back to a time when those living trees were young and see how big their tree rings are, match those up, and then you have a context for when this tree was being produced. And you can work your way pretty far back in time. This is showing going back to the 1790s. You can do this much farther back. It's kind of limited only by lengths of time when you would have usable tree samples. So they can use this method to date ancient shipwrecks, things like that. When was a ship built? It will be made up of wood, and you can maybe match the tree rings in the wood that makes up an ancient boat with this series of trees that were known from the area. So this is a pattern that'll hold up mostly for trees that grow from the same area. You wouldn't be able to compare our trees to trees from India or something like that. But if you have a local context, you can do pretty well with dendrochronology. So as trees grow, they also often end up with a big difference in color, as far as the newer wood typically being lighter in color, and the older wood often takes on a darker color. And so they have this term called heartwood and sapwood. And the heartwood, of course, toward the center of the plant, this is the wood that is in many cases just stopped functioning as xylem cells. So the tree as it grows, the living part of the tree, as we will see, is really contained only in this very outer edge in between the wood and the bark. So we saw before that wood is made up of xylem cells. Xylem cells are dead when they're mature. So this is all dead plant tissue in here. The bark is dead plant tissue, and there's a little bit of living tissue in between them. So the living tissue of the plant is kind of a skin around the woody plants, the woody part of the plant. And it doesn't need all of this water conduction. The xylem toward the inside is good for support, but it's not really needed for water conduction. So it can be kind of allowed to gum up and stop transporting water. So in some cases, it just ends up getting kind of clogged with contaminants. Sometimes the plants are actually putting their waste products into this part of the plant. It's a sort of unused area that's out of the way, and it just kind of gets disconnected from the stream of water flow. So that kind of gives rise to this other term, sapwood, for the outer wood. Sapwood would, if you cut this, more likely to have water in it, a little more sappy. And we see some different patterns, sometimes some evidence that that heartwood, the most inner wood, may have actually been the tougher wood as it received those contaminants or other chemicals that are put in there that sometimes can actually prevent rot on the inside of the heartwood, as shown here. So this is a tree that was cut down. The sapwood is experiencing some decay. The heartwood, not so decayed, kind of showing that it was a little bit tougher. But that's not always the case. We also have cases where some trees actually sort of rot from the inside. This is a feature that is a bit of a peril if you have a silver maple. Is kind of notorious for having this internal rotting process.